Professor Cox, it's a pleasure to have in our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. Election after election, it seems that immigration is a thorn at the side of every US president. It's a seemingly unresolvable problem that has become intractable, particularly in the 21st century, our time. Uh, but in your book, The President and Immigration Law, you seem to suggest otherwise, that real or imagined immigration crises actually empower presidents. Let's talk about that. Can you explain this, please?
Yeah, I think you're on to an important reality, which is that um, immigration policy has, for a long time, both been a challenge for presidents and members of Congress alike, and a source of opportunities. Um,
Source of opportunities. Okay.
yeah, so a great example would be in the immediate post-World War II era, when the Cold War is getting underway and America is reacting in the wake of the war to events, say, in Eastern Europe. President Eisenhower latches upon a series of demonstrations by Hungarian students, uh, demonstrations that are crushed by Soviet tanks, and he announces that the United States is going to provide protection for all those who were protesters who were affected by the crackdown. So Hungarians in countless numbers flee the country, come to the United States, and are allowed to enter the country pursuant to kind of this presidential announcement. Now, that might
Hmm.
sound a lot like what happens today, where presidents announce policy and the world changes, but it was happening
Yeah.
even back then. And indeed, President Eisenhower's actions set the stage for eventual congressional legislation that regularized the status of all those Hungarian immigrants who came and gave them eventual green cards and a pathway to citizenship. So that was an early example of a president seizing on a Cold War crisis to solidify the president's power to shape immigration policy.
Okay. Um, this is interesting that you talk about Ike sort of taking the forefront in response to the Hungarian students and the revolt. I think it was in the 1950s. In your book, I review that point because in your book you bestow the title of immigration policy maker
Mhm.
to the president, which obviously includes Ike. So is but isn't the president the policymaker in chief for pretty much everything? Are you drawing a distinction here between immigration and other issues? For example, going back to your Ike example, he was the policymaker in chief for getting our freeways going, right?
Yeah, and it's true. I mean, I think today
Mm-hmm.
the presidency and our modern presidents are extremely powerful. And so it's really common today to think that the president is essentially in charge of everything. We think about environmental policy
Yeah,
or education policy, the like, and the first thing we think about or tax policy, and the first thing we think about is what is the White House position on this matter?
exactly,
Um,
exactly.
that's a really modern way of thinking about American politics. It's not the way people thought about American politics for a very long time. In the 19th century, presidents were weak by and large. It was a relatively weak institution, the presidency.
Huh.
Over the course of the 20th century, for a bunch of complicated reasons, including the fact that we fought two enormous wars, and more recently, the fact that politics have become more polarized. There's a bunch of reasons that political scientists have attributed to the changes, but presidents have become more powerful. So first, I just want to acknowledge we're obviously operating in a world where today the president is much more powerful than the presidency has been for a really long time.
Hmm.
And so we might think that the story we're telling in our book, the book that I wrote with my colleague and friend Christine Rodriguez, is really just an account of how, in the domain of immigration law, like everywhere else, the president became much more powerful in the 20th century. Um, And we don't want to suggest that somehow immigration law was immune to those other developments. So it is certainly true that the fact that presidents in general have become more powerful has had an impact on immigration law and policy. But the story we tell, which traces back further into the past than this kind of modern story about powerful presidents, is really about two features of immigration law that are unique, that do set it apart from things like environmental policy or health policy or tax policy. Um, Two features of immigration law and history that have kind of uniquely empowered presidents.
Okay.
So let me just break them down and tell you what the two are. So one of them has to do with the thing you asked about in your first question, which is the effect of perceived and real emergencies. So immigration law is a domain where emergencies have historically cropped up to a greater extent than they have in some of these other regulatory arenas. We don't frequently speak about environmental emergencies, though to be sure, like climate change probably is one, but it's
Yeah,
not that
yeah.
we talk about, it's a slow moving emergency. But in immigration law, things are often very, very fast moving. The example of the Hungarian protests is a great one because events transpired overnight and the country needed to respond. Or when tens of thousands of Cubans took to boats and headed for the United States southern coast in 1980, the Cuban boat lift posed an immediate and urgent question, which was what was going to happen to all these folks. And so those moments of crisis have led Congress over time to delegate to the president increasingly large amounts of power. So that's the first thing is crises have led Congress to kind of openly say we're happy to let the president manage certain situations. And that's made immigration law unique in relation to other kind of regulatory arenas.
Is part of that delegation a practical issue? The practical issue of Congress is just not set up to react that quickly.
Exactly. So,
Yeah,
for example, really each time we fought a big war, Congress has passed a statute early in the war, or sometimes just before the war began, telling the president during the time of war, you can regulate entry into and exit out of the United States kind of however you want, in the recognition that Congress would likely not be in a position to react swiftly enough to manage situations on the
yeah.
ground. And so giving that power to the president. So yeah, that's the kind of emergencies, real or perceived, is one thing that has made immigration policymaking unique. We see it today, right? All of the rhetoric around immigration policy today is a rhetoric of emergency. There's an
Yeah, the
emergency
southern
on the
border,
border, there's an
yeah,
emergency in New York. And so that rhetoric really drives immigration politics, not just
yeah,
policymaking
yeah, yeah.
today.
So that's one of
That's
two.
one.
Mhm.
The second one is really different. It's a kind of a long-term development in immigration law, which was over the course of nearly 40 years.
40 years. Okay.
Um, Congress and the president and other actors basically erected an enormous shadow immigration system in America that effectively allowed lots of people to enter the country without permission and to remain, such that we ended up in a place today where there are more than 10 million people who live in this country without legal authorization. And they're not here simply because there was a failure of enforcement. They're here because there was an effective political equilibrium where both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, were happy with
Yeah, I
an
was
immigration
going to say 40
system.
years. That includes both parties. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It began to emerge in the late 1960s and early 1970s after our government terminated a very large temporary worker program that we had negotiated with Mexico that operated for more than 2 decades. That program at its peak brought almost 500,000 temporary, mostly agricultural workers into this country every year. Congress eventually shut that program down and at the same time imposed pretty significant quantitative restrictions on the number of people who could immigrate to the United States from Central and South America.
Hmm.
Prior to the 1960s, there were no numerical limits on immigration from Central and South America.
Wait, when you say immigration, are you referring to temporary immigration per the law that you just um, suggested terminated temporary program?
At that time, it was both temporary and permanent. So there was
Okay.
not a limit on the number of people who could receive green cards from, say, Mexico or Honduras prior to the middle part of the 1960s, even though there were such limits for all other parts of the world.
Hmm.
So Congress eliminates a big temporary worker program. It restricts access to green cards for people from Central and South America, and at the same time adopts, enforcement policies and provides resources to the immigration enforcement agencies that ensure that we're not going to have anything like complete enforcement along the border or in the interior of this country. And most were happy with that, right? It
Hmm.
satisfied business interests who didn't want there to be more significant restrictions on the access that they had to essentially overseas labor markets to invite people to come here to work. Um, and it satisfied many others. And so we kind of were in a political equilibrium for about 3 or 4 decades where many folks were permitted to come, even though without permission. And there wasn't a serious effort to remove large numbers of people who didn't have legal authorization, right? Removal usually was focused on a small subset of people, like people who had been convicted of crimes and what have you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
you end up
President
with a
Trump has
situation.
lashed on that, the
Yes.
criminals. Yes. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And so now that's a big setup. So the question is, what does all this have to do with presidential power? Right? That's the
Yeah.
natural question after I've told this. That's an interesting political
Exactly.
statement, but what's that got to do with presidential power? Well, the thing that's got to do with presidential power is that the president, in our constitutional system, is the enforcer in chief, right? In a kind of schoolhouse rock version of American government, Congress writes the laws, the president enforces the laws, and courts resolve disputes that come up in the enforcement of the
Yeah.
laws, right? So ordinarily you think, well, that gives Congress power. That puts Congress in the driver's seat. Congress gets to decide like who's going to come to this country, who's going to be forced to leave this country. But when you have a legal system like immigration law, where, and this is the important number, where basically half of the people who are subject to the regime, so something like 11 or 12 million of the 22 million non-citizens who live in the US, they're here in violation of law. Well, at that point, the laws that Congress writes just are no longer that important because the real question is who from among this large pool of 12 million people will the president decide get to stay? Because the president's going to direct the enforcement machinery to focus on some people and not on others. And that's why over the past several decades, what we've seen is really sharp shifts across administrations in what immigration policy looks like. And it's in part because they're just adopting kind of different priorities about how much they want to target people for deportation, who they want to target for deportation. And so that's been a big determinant of our modern immigration policy is basically what does enforcement look like?
Professor Cox, I want to make sure I'm following here with respect to the $11 million immigrants that are in violation. Are you saying that they sort of fall into a void that's not covered by congressional laws and it's really goes within the purview of the president to decide what to do with them?
Yeah, because I mean, in a sense, they're not in a void, right? They are covered by the law in the sense that they are all in violation of law in some formal sense. They either entered the country without being inspected and they're therefore deportable,
Or
or
stayed longer?
or they overstayed whatever
Yeah.
visa they were on, their permission
Uh-huh.
to remain, and therefore they're deportable. And that means they're all covered by the law, but they're all in legally basically the same position. The law doesn't dictate which of those people should be priorities for enforcement,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
the way we tend to think
yeah.
about law is what does immigration law do? We tend to think of it as it's a really complicated screening tool, right? It's this
Hmm.
intricate set of rules that say, here are all the qualifications a person needs to have if they want to come to America, right? They've got to have these family connections or these labor market connections or this educational background. And we write these long, complicated rules. It looks like the tax code, you know, its level of detail.
Yeah.
It seems to it creates these really fine distinctions among people based on their qualifications and background. But then it turns out that for all those people who are here in violation of law, none of that matters. There are
Yeah.
no distinctions legally among them. But of course, that doesn't mean they're all going to be treated identically. Instead, it means that the people who enforce the law, they're the ones who are going to get to decide who gets treated one way and who gets treated another way.
Wow, that gives the president a lot of power. 11 million people who
11 million.
I assume most of them are actually working and businesses rely on him. Um, Let me ask a follow-up question about two examples you provided. One
Sure.
was President Ike and Hungarian students. You sort of gave them refugee status or help. And then the Cuban boat crisis in the 1980s, which I remember. Um, in those cases, where executive orders issued, presidential executive orders issued to deal with those? Because that's different than law and that's different than policy, right? When I think of policy, I think of something that lasts 10, 15, 20 years,
Mhm.
something longer. Law is something that's got to be passed by Congress. An executive order is that if Professor Cox was President Cox, he could write an executive order, sign exit, right?
Right.
So were the two examples executive orders essentially? They couldn't be policy, were they?
So neither of them is an executive order.
Ah, interesting.
Um,
Okay.
Law and congressional statutes are in the background in both cases, but in kind of interesting and contradictory ways. So let me explain. The power that Dwight Eisenhower invoked to invite the Hungarian students
Mm,
to enter the United States was a power that Congress had expressly delegated to the president in its big 1952 overhaul of federal immigration law. So in 1952, after the
oh.
war, Congress overhauls federal immigration law and passes the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952. And in that
Hmm.
statute, Congress hands the president two complementary powers. The first one is called the parole power, and it says to the executive branch, technically the power is given to the attorney general, not the president, but of course it's supervised by the president.
Of
So it
course,
says
yeah.
to the executive branch, we've written down all these complicated rules about when prospective non-citizens, not prospective immigrants to this country, non-citizens who are outside the country, when they're inadmissible, when they aren't allowed under law to get a visa, basically, right? So
Hmm.
you're excludable from the country for a bunch of different reasons. You have a criminal history, all, insufficient educational qualifications. So we've created this complicated list as Congress, but president and executive branch officials, we're telling you, you have this power to parole into the country any person who is otherwise inadmissible under the law, so long as you think essentially that it promotes a humanitarian purpose.
I see.
So it's a really broad
Of
authority,
course, yeah, yeah.
potentially, that's being given to the executive branch officials. Now, to be sure, Congress, when it wrote it, didn't think of it as a broad authority. It
Hmm.
thought that it was more of like a administrative managerial authority. Like the idea would be someone arrives at a port of entry and they're in dire need of medical assistance, or they're 8.5 months pregnant,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
something. And so they might need to land briefly. And they thought this is what the parole power is going to be for. It's going to be used by low-level immigration officials to permit small numbers of people to land for kind of urgent and temporary needs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's one power. Second power Congress gave the president, and this one's to the president himself, we call the suspension power.
Suspension power.
And it's
Okay.
effectively the opposite. So it says, we've written down all these rules about which non-citizens are permitted to come to the United States. So if you've got the right educational qualifications, the right family connections, whatever it is, you're admissible. You can come to the US, except we give the president the power to bar the entry of any otherwise admissible immigrant if the president thinks that
Wow.
their entry is not in the national interest.
Is the 1952 overhaul of immigration law still law?
It is. Now, that power, everybody understood at the time was enormous. So they thought the parole power was a small little
Yeah,
power.
yeah, yeah.
They thought the suspension power was a huge and potentially divisive power. Indeed, several members of Congress were really, really upset about the inclusion of the suspension power in the 1952 Act.
Hmm.
Both get enacted into law by Congress. And then a funny thing happens. The suspension power basically doesn't get invoked by presidents for 3 decades
Oh,
and doesn't
they
really get
rely
invoked.
on the little narrow part.
Yeah, and doesn't get invoked
Huh.
in any real serious way by president until President Donald Trump in his first term. The suspension power was the legal authority cited by the president for his so-called Muslim ban.
Oh, the one that he
And
put in
that's the
effect for,
first
yeah.
high-profile use of that authority since 1952. Okay, so that's the suspension power. The parole power, on the other hand, which everybody thought was this little administrative power, gets wielded by president after president, Democrat and Republican alike, to basically invent modern refugee policy. So it's not used to like allow a single person who's at a port of entry in temporarily for urgent care. Instead, it's used by Eisenhower to invite some 30,000 Hungarians to enter the country. It's used by President Carter during the Mariel boat lift to allow, I think it was something like 120,000 Cubans to enter the country.
Wow.
Um, and in
Not
that
not
case,
narrow at all,
not
right?
narrow,
Yeah, yeah.
big. And
Wow.
in that case, what's even more remarkable is President Carter, when he acts to, authorize the entry of Cubans during the boat lift, is acting about 4 months after Congress had enacted the Refugee Act of 1980. So Congress finally got into the picture, wrote its own law that said, here's our refugee policy. Here's how we want the government to decide who should be admitted as a refugee and who should not be admitted as a refugee. And President Carter looked at the law and said, that's great, but I'm just going to ignore it. And instead, I'm going to use this other power to admit all these folks from Cuba. And
Oh,
so that's
wow.
just a great example of the way in which
Yeah.
repeatedly presidents have used the kind of authorities delegated to them to really shape immigration policy, even in ways that are probably not what Congress has wanted.
Yeah. So in the case of President Carter, he was, so to speak, on all fours when he chose to use the 1952 law because, as I asked you earlier, it wasn't repealed.
Yeah, exactly. It hadn't been repealed. And indeed, Congress did make amendments to it. It tried several times to tweak the language to
Hmm.
constrain the power of the president. At one point, Congress added the words on a case by case basis
Yeah, yeah.
to suggest like you can't just announce that 100,000 people can enter. They tweaked the language about what kinds of humanitarian purpose would count to try to constrain authority, but none of those kind of technical changes to the law ever had practical significance in restricting the president's power.
Wow, that is very interesting. Uh, the law of unintended consequences. That's why
Yeah,
lawyers have jobs. When I went to law school, I know we were
exactly.
to pour over
Exactly.
these things. You use the phrase in your book and other writings, uh, quote, immigration exceptionalism. What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Well, to me, it means two things. One thing it means is really just everything we've been talking about up till now, right? Which is a kind of label we can put on the fact that immigration law does have these special features
Hmm.
because of its history, right? It has this unusual feature of empowering presidents because so many people are in violation of the law. And it has this unusual feature that Congress has over time kind of quite deliberately given away a lot of its power. Congress doesn't write environmental statutes that say, Mr. President, whatever you think is good for the environment, do that. Like that, but basically we have some provisions in immigration law that kind of look like that. Anybody you want to say
Interesting.
they can't come, you can say that. So the del so it's exceptional in that sense as an arena for politics and policy. Um, among immigration lawyers and immigrants' rights lawyers, it stands for another proposition as well, which is this old idea that that maybe the reason why immigration policy looks different today is because the courts decided long ago that ordinary constitutional rules that constrain government when it creates education policy or environmental policy or tax policy, that those constitutional rules shouldn't apply to immigration law. So that like it's like
Ah,
a black hole for
huh.
constitutional law. And it's true that today it is super common for political actors, Justice Department lawyers, and even the Supreme Court to suggest that in some ways, immigration law and policy is a constitutional black hole. So, like very recently, the Supreme Court decided a case involving a person who'd crossed into the United States uh, and had been apprehended by Border Patrol agents, in the US, but not very far into the US and not very long after this person had crossed into the US. Person challenged the legality of their confinement. They were held in custody, they were detained, and they said, my detention is unlawful because I wasn't provided with a fair hearing at which I could explain that I was in fact a refugee seeking asylum.
The due process.
A due process claim.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Supreme Court said, not only do you have no due process rights, you actually have no habeas corpus rights, which is a fancy Latin legal phrase, which means a right to go to a court and challenge the lawfulness of your physical detention by government officials. Now, just to put that holding in context, so this is a person who was apprehended inside the US, is being held in the US in federal custody, and they're saying you can't go to court, even to question the legality. Contrast that decision with the Guantanamo Bay decisions. So,
Huh.
Our government apprehended people overseas who the government then alleged were enemy combatants, and it brought some of those people to Guantanamo Bay. They never set foot in the United States, and they challenged the lawfulness of their confinement. In an important Supreme Court case called Boumediene, the Supreme Court said, even these non-citizens, they're not citizens, they've never been here,
They're enemy combatants.
they're alleged to be enemy combatants, even they have a right under our Constitution to contest the legality of their confinement at the hands of our government.
Wait,
And
Professor
yeah,
Cox, that doesn't make sense though.
yeah. So
These two cases are at odds then.
to me, they feel like they are, but they're explained. The court says today, and other folks say today, by this idea of immigration exceptionalism, that the ordinary constitutional rules that apply in general to our government don't apply when what is at stake is immigration policy. So
Wow.
that's a very conventional modern idea, and it's actually attributed to the very oldest federal immigration cases. So one of the things that's important about this idea, especially for a Supreme Court that purports to be an originalist court, is that it can be traced back to the very beginning of federal immigration law. And that I think is wrong. So in other writing, not in the book with Christina, but in other recent work, I've aimed to show that actually when our government first started to create restrictive immigration policies in the late 19th century, the Supreme Court responded to those policies as it would have responded to really any other federal policy. It applied utterly ordinary constitutional law. It
Hmm.
subjected those immigration policies to completely conventional judicial oversight, including, by the way, permitting people who were detained pursuant to those immigration laws to go to court to challenge their
Right of
confinement.
habeas corpus. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so there's actually, a kind of lost history where we have mistakenly, and when I say we, I mean pretty much everybody in the legal academy, including me in my early papers, like whether people on the left, people on the right, people on the left have decried this doctrine. People on the right have endorsed it, but everybody's basically agreed that it is the law, that immigration is constitutionally special. But that just wasn't the case in the 19th century. And so we invented immigration exceptionalism in a much more recent era than is typically imagined.
That is fascinating. So in the 19th century, American courts didn't carve out some sort of special area, kind of like foreign policy, and give it to the president like they're doing now. Uh, I want to ask this about the 19th century. Um Earlier, you said that presidential power vis-a-vis immigration policy has really increased in the 20th century.
Yeah.
But immigration was a humongous deal in the 19th century as well. I mean, not only we had a lot of immigrants coming to our country, but also there was a lot of political backlash, also
Yeah.
sort of racial components to it. And obviously that really exploded in the 1910s and 1920s and all
Mhm.
the restrictions. But it's not like it was, all hugs and kisses as far as immigration goes after Civil War. So why the difference between presidential power vis-a-vis immigration then versus the 20th century? What changed?
Yeah. That's a good question. And in part, it relates to the kind of long historical trajectory that I described earlier.
Hmm.
It it required us to get to the point where Congress wrote down a bunch of rules that said, President, we give you lots of power. And it required us to get to a point where we had a huge number of people living in the country who were in violation of the law to empower the president in the particular ways that the president is empowered today. So
Yeah.
our modern equilibrium of presidential power, like, can only be arrived at after that historical sequence of events. But that's not to say that the president was powerless or something in the 19th century.
Yeah.
The 19th century world of immigration policymaking was just so radically different than our modern world. It's hard to know how to compare or weigh presidential power in a kind of comparative sense in the two eras. Because in the 19th century, um, immigration policymaking was like predominantly, until the final 2 decades of the century, it was predominantly a diplomatic affair.
Huh.
Like, most of our immigration policy was made in the form of treaties that we negotiated with other countries. So in some sense, that empowered the president. The president played a pretty central role because the president was principally responsible for negotiating those treaties. So
So
the
we were
treaties,
making treaties with the governments of respective countries about how
right?
many of their citizens can come to our country.
Um, we were making agreements with these other countries about immigration policy. Now, interestingly, immigration policy in the earlier era never contained quotas.
Oh,
So our
oh,
modern idea that a core feature of immigration policy is the numerical kind of restriction of access to immigration was utterly foreign to 19th century ways of thinking of an immigration policy.
how about the Chinese Exclusion Act? When did,
Yeah. So complete exclusion, yes. So a
okay.
prohibition on certain classes or categories of people coming, those were a part of the conversation.
Hmm.
So, even before the federal government got in the business of regulating immigration, states and local governments adopted poor laws that would try to keep out people who were poor. Quarantine laws tried to keep out people who were sick, and then eventually the federal government got in the business and tried to keep out people on the basis of their race. So we
Yeah.
had regimes of exclusion that told people they couldn't come. But what we didn't have was quotas, the idea that, like, immigration is a scarce resource that we have to allocate in small numbers
Yeah, yeah,
across
yeah.
a kind of large number of people that will want to come. The rise of quotas in the 20th century, in the wake of World War One, they created a completely new set of problems because they effectively made immigration, access to the United States, kind of like a valuable property right, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
By
Hmm.
by by it's like any market. Like, if you make a good scarce, it can become more valuable because there's not enough of it to
Kind of
meet
like a
demand. And that, of course, gives rise to all kinds of regulatory problems as people respond, to the limitations that are imposed by the government. Um,
Kind of like you can limit it and then charge $5 million for a green card or call it
exactly.
a
Exactly. To bring it
interesting.
close to home to the president. And by the way, we kind of do that. We actually do have, there is a green card category where, an investor visa where basically if you pony up about $1 million, you can get a green card.
That
So
already exists.
that already exists. It's called the EB-5 visa. Yeah.
So
So President Trump's, proposal is to broaden it to quite literally auction off the visas. But we do already have features of modern immigration law that look kind of like auctions.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so
Let's take a break here. Stay with me as Professor Cox and I get into the perspective. Professor Cox, I may be asking the obvious here. If the president is indeed our immigration policy maker in chief, and we get a new president every 4 years, or, well, we have an election for a president every 4 years, then that makes immigration a highly politicized matter, right?
it can.
It can.
I think one of the interesting things about American immigration policy um, that is easy to quickly forget is just how short the recent historical period has been in which immigration has been a deeply divisive partisan issue. Like it just
Oh,
wasn't
really?
for most of the 20th century, at least. Um, and indeed, evidence of that is the fact that the most recent immigration amnesty signed into law in this country, right? A piece of legislation that gave legal status to about 3 million undocumented immigrants. Like if I asked you, you could probably correctly guess that that statute was written by a Democratic Congress.
Yeah.
But you might not as quickly guess that it was signed into law by Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And even as recently, and this is often forgotten, even as recently as the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, immigration policy was really truly a bipartisan affair. Like early in his administration, before September 11th, President Bush spoke about wanting to work with Congress to get comprehensive immigration reform. He himself proposed the idea of creating a new modern, large-scale temporary worker program in order to relieve pressure on the southern border and facilitate like access to labor markets, both for employers in this country and for potential employees living outside this country. I mean, those sound like ideas coming out of the Democratic leadership,
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
from a Republican president. And yet that was the status quo in early 2000. And
So,
so, yeah, it's been a sharp and dramatic shift just in the past 2 decades.
look, I want to draw a contrast between the last 20, 30 years, Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. and President Reagan, to the 1920s. We had severe restrictions and quotas on immigration. And also, there was the Red Scare and all sorts of different things. So that was a heightened era of anxiety about immigration. When you say this is a recent phenomenon, are you talking about the fact that it's been politicized, or that it's not bipartisan anymore? What is your focus here?
The second, it's of course. I mean, immigration
Hmm.
is a politically and economically and culturally divisive issue across time in this
Yeah,
country.
yeah,
Like the idea that America, was an open nation that said to the world, give us your poor,
yeah,
give
yeah,
us your hungry, that inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty, that's always been false, right? from the founding forward, people have always been afraid of at least some immigrants, right? When we got into a quasi-war with France, just within a decade of cropping up our new United States government, people were so fearful of French agitators that there were proposals to extend the naturalization period for new migrants to like 15 years. And indeed, they did briefly do so. Congress Congress passed a law that gave the president unfettered power to unilaterally deport anybody who the
Oh,
president thought was a danger to the
wow.
country. And that's right when we got started. So it's always been with us. It's changed who we're afraid of. You know, it was fear about Irish immigration and Catholics in the 1830s and 50s. It's fear of immigration from China and other parts of Asia in the latter part of the 19th century. It turns to fear of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe in the early part of the 20th century, the period you're referring to, where we get the rise of first the literacy test for immigration, which was clearly
Well,
designed to
yeah.
restrict immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then in the wake of World War One, we get the first quotas, the national origins quotas laws, which were designed to engineer the demographics of America by replicating our racial composition,
Yeah.
essentially. So it's always been the case that it's been deeply political. That's right. That's absolutely right. What's changed recently is that, as our national political environment in general has become much more polarized in a partisan sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The
That's the huge
parties are
difference.
in clearer camps. They no longer can agree on anything. That's happened with respect to immigration, just like other issues. So this modern change is very much a way in which immigration is like everything else. Like everything has become polarized, and immigration is just one of
Yeah.
those.
So it's the loss of bipartisan approach to problem solving. That's the
Yeah,
new phenomena in
yeah.
our history. Um, as we're having this conversation, I guess it's just a statement. It's not even a question, Professor Cox. Given that the president has so much power over immigration matters, this gives any president, he or she, a lot of power to rev up issues about immigration and win elections.
Yeah. And I think that that is also a product of our modern polarized environment. Like if
Yeah.
you look back to voter surveys from the 80s or the 90s or even the early 2000s, and surveys that ask voters what the most important issues are to them in an election,
Mm-hmm.
immigration was never anywhere near the top of the list.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so it's not just that it's become more polarized, but partly I think because polarization has created opportunities for politicians in the way that you just suggested, our political environment has moved in a direction that has made immigration a much more salient political issue. And so now in this past election, it basically topped the list for many voters.
Yeah. And as you and I talked about during the break, President Trump brought it up several times in his
Yeah.
address to the joint session of Congress. Um, you know, we've been talking about immigration for the past 40 some minutes. But I want to make sure that I'm understanding the gist of your book, The President and Immigration Law. That's the title.
Mhm.
As I was preparing for my conversation with you, I came away with this, which it seems to be confirmed now. This book is more about constitutional law and it has a focus on immigration versus being a book about immigration. Am I close in my assessment?
I mean, you're right that it's not like Christina and I, we're not historians, nor are we political scientists. So we didn't set out to write a book that just told immigration history in America.
Yeah.
And we also didn't set out to write a book that just tried to analyze the politics of immigration over the course of American history. We are lawyers, so we
Yeah.
are interested in law, but not just constitutional law. We're interested in the way law kind of works as a tool to regulate people's lives. And so we were interested in particular in the way in which immigration law had changed over the course of American history to empower presidents to really intervene a lot more directly in the lives of immigrants than had historically been the case, or than is the case in a lot of other areas of federal law, like tax policy is maybe our, the kind of like example I have to come back to. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
of course, the president, supervises the IRS and has authority to, do a lot in that domain. But we tend to think like, oh, who decides what our taxes look like? Congress. Congress writes tax laws. They set the tax rates. They decide how much of our income is going to go to the federal government. And the story we really wanted to tell was a story about how that had kind of stopped being true for immigration law, even though historically there had been a long period where it sort of had been true.
Yeah. The reason
So,
I mentioned that, I said this is this seems to me to be more about constitutional laws. That as I was reviewing your material, the thing that kept on popping in my head is separation of powers. Separation of
mhm,
powers. That's
yeah.
that's that's why I mentioned that. Was there an event, some sort of impetus that compelled you and Professor Rodriguez to write this?
So it was exactly that separation of powers question that you just alluded to. So Christina and I, um, we met first not long after we both became law professors at a conference in Las Vegas, of all places.
Yeah.
Um, and we were talking about um, the field and the way people thought about American immigration policy in relationship to lots of other areas. And we had both wondered about presidential power in part because there's this conventional legal idea, this idea of immigration exceptionalism that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
labeled, it's known among lawyers as something called the immigration plenary power doctrine. And that doctrine, the way it's described by courts, always contrasts courts on the one hand with the quote political branches on the other. So it's created all these rules that are about the power of the quote political branches. And Christine and I started having a conversation about how it was an odd thing for a court in our American system of separation of powers, which has three branches of government, to kind of collapse them into just a dichotomy, courts on the one hand and the political branches on the other. And that got us thinking like, well, what's going on between the political branches? Like, what is the story about how
Yeah.
power is getting allocated between Congress and the president in this domain? And that's what set us on the kind of course that led to this book. Now, I will say, I don't know if this is an embarrassing fact about the intellectual history of this book, something we should be proud of, is we wrote the first paper that contains the kind of core idea of this book in the waning days of the George W. Bush administration.
Oh,
So
that
this
long
might
ago.
look
Okay.
like a book that was written, when President Trump was first elected, but it wasn't. And when we wrote that first paper, I remember workshopping the paper, and plenty of folks said to us, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting intellectual idea, but I don't think people are going to care very much about exactly how much power the president has
Are you
in
kidding me? It's
doing
all
that.
over the news
It's
now.
not a particularly important issue for us. And so, President Obama got elected and he started to do things that we had suggested in our earlier articles were possibilities that hadn't been. We think the president could probably do X, Y, and Z, which hadn't been
Yeah.
done. And President Obama did X, Y, and Z. And we thought, it's kind of happening. And then we decided to write the book, and we had an entire draft of the manuscript done about a week before President Trump was elected the first time.
Wow.
And his election, happened right around the time we were workshopping a draft of the book to a small audience. And they all said, well, you're going to have to rewrite the book at this point. Are all your claims going to be proven false by this new presidency? And we sat back and we waited a little bit. And it turned out that although obviously the politics of his choices were radically different than President Obama's, pretty much
Yeah.
everything that happened in the first Trump administration confirmed our core thesis,
Yeah.
really
Yeah. Yeah.
reinforced it. In fact, what's the weirdest aspect for us about the book is that when we started writing it, we were writing against a conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom was Congress is the powerful actor in this area.
Yeah.
The president's not very powerful. And we were trying to explain why we thought that was wrong. And by the time we finished the book, everybody agreed that the president was powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
realized instead our task was really to explain to people why it was that the president had become so powerful. that that was really the story we were telling.
This is a fascinating story. In a way, President Trump has been good for your book business in many ways.
I mean, there are certainly intellectually interesting things
Yeah,
about
yeah,
each and every administration, but the first Trump administration in particular.
yeah. If you wanted our audience to remember just one point about the President of the United States and immigration, what would that one point be?
I think the one point I would choose to emphasize today
Mm-hmm.
about our book, what are we? How many days are we into this new administration?
Is it,
Whatever.
is it, it's less than 2 months,
Less than 2 months
like
into
40
this new
days or
administration.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the point that I would choose to emphasize today that I don't think we emphasized as much when we wrote the book is that as powerful as the president is in immigration law, and we do say this, but it's not an emphasis, his power doesn't come from some core constitutional claim to exclusive authority over this domain. Like it's the president is not historically powerful because he can say, I and I alone, because of my foreign affairs authority or my national security authority or whatever it is, I get to make the rules and no one can supersede me. That's not historically been the source of his power.
Hmm.
His power has come because Congress has given it to him on the one hand, and because there are just lots of people here who are in violation of the law on the other.
The 2 points
And
that you made in the first segment.
exactly.
Yeah.
And the reason that point is really important to remember today is I could imagine someone just reading the title of our book or the first few pages and concluding, aha, this book is a definitive defense of all of the claims of executive authority that the current administration is making about immigration policy. But in fact, as much as we think the president is powerful, this book, I think, shows why the particular assertions of authority by the Trump administration recently are mostly wrong. Like, for the most part, the president doesn't have the power to disregard federal statutes that regulate immigration. And so when he says he can ignore the federal asylum laws or ignore other statutes, there's just not historical support for that.
Another conclusion is that, and this is my conclusion, Professor Cox, is that if this power that any president claims to have over immigration matter is not something that is inherently etched in our Constitution, that it's bestowed by Congress, then ergo, Congress can limit it or take it away.
That's right. It can change. And so that's exactly right. And I think
Yeah.
that's the important thing to recognize in this moment is we're in a particular political equilibrium, but these rules, as you said, they're not set in stone. Congress
Yeah.
could choose to assert, the authority that it already has, and it could choose to pass new laws that would further constrain the president's authority over some of these matters.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Professor Cox, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so very much, Professor Cox.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.